So, hi everybody. We're the Data Science and AI Society. We're a new society and we're focused on data science, AI, machine learning, anything related to big data. We focus on. So yeah, we just started. We're running a few events. Just get into it. So we have this is our planned events. So teaching series, what we're doing right now, weekly, John comes in and gives a lecture about AI, any topic. It doesn't have to be necessarily about tech. It can be anything. So AI with law, AI with psychology. Yeah. So particular things about the teaching series. So the first thing is it is both hybrid and in person. So you can join anytime. If you can't make it in person, you can always join online. And second, the Q&A we post through 2, 3 days earlier. So any topics, any questions, just put in a few days earlier so John can maybe formulate the lectures based on the topic. So yeah, project-based learning, we're currently working with a few companies to bring it in into action. So one thing, the reason I started this club was a lot of people focus more on the theory of AI and data science, which is good, but I feel like you need to have more practical usage. So, and real world, because there is a huge gap between once you graduate and that in person, there's a huge gap. So we're trying to bridge it. Third, we have guest lectures and industry talks. So where people in the professional scene come in and give a talk on AI, yeah, basically. And they talk. Some companies we have office visits, which I'll just talk about in a bit. Um, they discuss internship and placement opportunities, and yeah, we have Q&A with speakers also. And the fourth one is collaborations and competitions. I think towards December and then mid-Feb we might bring in a lot of competitions, maybe Kaggle style, maybe hackathons. So that's something we're trying very hard to bring in. So yeah. So these are our links. You have the WhatsApp group. So anything we post is always first on WhatsApp, and then we go to like other social media. So I think for the Kanos event, we first posted in WhatsApp. I think it's sold out in like 2 hours. And then the link tree is for any other social media. So if you guys want to take a photo. Fine. Yeah. So the first event we're running on October 2nd is the Kanos office visit. So I think Kanos is like 5 minutes away. So we're doing an office visit. At the same time, we are doing internships and opportunities. I think there's a lot of recruiters coming in. At the same time, we have a data science and AI panel coming in to talk about anything you guys want to talk about. So this is currently sold out. It's actually crazy how we sold out within like 2, 3 hours. But it's fine if you guys didn't get an opportunity. We have another talk the next day with Arrow Electronics. So we're doing a workshop with them on October 9th with George Dickey. He's coming in. He's the technology segment leader. So it's just a teaser. We haven't confirmed the venue yet, but yeah, this is open to pretty much anybody. So I think along with Arrow, IET is coming, so Institute of Engineering Technology. So we might add another X onto it. I don't know. Yeah. So these will be out in the next week or so. So members, of course, get first priority, and then all members. Yeah, so as I said, for the Q&A, any questions you want John to answer now, just take a photo. I think it's Slido. Just put your questions in and yeah, John can answer.
Sweet. Sweet, 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 sweet. Okay, cool. Can you do the Slido stuff? Is it
Yeah.
like before? Is that cool?
No
Brilliant.
names.
Yeah. So you can sort of can you ask the question as if
Yeah.
it's your question? Yeah. Okay, cool, everybody. I'm gonna disconnect your thing now. Right. Make sure we don't run out of power while I'm talking. Can everybody hear me okay, or do you want me to amplify? You're cool? Can you hear it all right? All right, sweet. Okay, cool. So every week I somewhat wing it and just start talking about different things to do with AI. For those of you who are new, I'm going to give you a brief intro to what I've been talking about. So I think we've had 9 talks so far. So we started over the summer with Teams calls. And everything's been recorded. There's a playlist on YouTube that's currently unlisted. And if you're really finding it hard to sleep, you can watch whatever, over 9 hours of me chatting to you about crazy things. Um, just to give you a little bit of a whirlwind tour of some of the things we talked about, particularly things that will lead into what I'm about to talk about today. I initially sort of talked a little bit about why you might want to pay attention to what I'm talking about, why you're interested in AI, in particular, the sort of transition that has occurred with the invention of ChatGPT and the impact that it's having on industry, which will become a little bit relevant in a moment. So one of the things that I was talking about was I was suggesting that the first phase of commercialization of AI hasn't been particularly successful. And what that typically consisted of was management consultancy firms like McKinsey and Bain and PwC and people like that selling to companies AI products. And mostly what they sold was called RAG systems. So what they do is they say, okay, well, what we'll do is we'll give you a kind of private, personalized chat GPT. We'll gather your business data together in a special kind of database called a vector database. And we will use what's called a RAG system, which will try to, whenever you ask a question of it, it will look inside this database and it will try to find bits of information relevant to your business and put that sort of in a hidden way into the chat so that the AI can use that information in answering your question. So if you happen to have an organization that's very bureaucratic, has a lot of processes and things like that, and you ask a question about, say, at Queen's, they built one of these things, how do I apply for exceptional circumstances? It would look in the database, find a documentation about that, stick it in the chat, and provide it to people. So this is an example of something which is called a solution in search of a problem. It's a weird situation where people think they need something, but they aren't able to properly articulate the problem that they have. The problem they have is that they just want to be new and technologically sophisticated. It's very unlikely that you will be successful deploying a project that doesn't have a clear problem associated with it. So it gets to be a bit aimless. And that's kind of what happened with the first phase. What's happened recently is that AI programming has now become really rather good. And what I talk about in previous talks is about Claude Sonnet 4, which was the first model which saved me time, basically. So the previous models had a tendency to break code. Once the code was reasonably large, if you asked it to do something, it would change something, but it would introduce a problem every time it made a change. And so that's basically unusable. Claude Sonnet 4 was smart enough that it didn't do that, and GPT-5 more recently is even better than that as well. I haven't had a chance to check. There is now a version of GPT-5. GPT-5 comes from OpenAI, if you don't already know, and that is designed for their IDE, which which is fine-tuned specifically for their IDE, which is supposedly even better. And very soon we're expecting Google to release Gemini 3, which could well be even better as well. And that's getting into slightly spooky territory in terms of how good it is at programming. And if you watch the videos, you'll see that I talk about, I'm a really heavy user of AI programming, right? So I pretty much bought everything. I pay $200 a month for Cursor. I pay £100 a month for Claude Max. I spend almost all my free time programming, which unfortunately I have much less of than I usually have. But we're talking like hours a day. Certainly that's what it was like over the summer. And I love it. It's really, really good, fascinating, encountered lots of problems with it. And one of the core problems that I encounter a lot is that interacting with the AI is kind of like interacting with someone who's very young, or that's sort of being a bit cruel to young people, actually, but interacting with something that wants to please you, but is in some fundamentally way kind of immoral. And the way in which it presents itself as being immoral is, in order to do AI programming, other than like the fake examples they show in the demos, What you have to do is you have to do something called test-driven development, where you write some computer code that can automatically verify whether the code is working or not. And most of what I am doing is breaking a large project into small pieces with very well-defined tests. Now, the AI is quite good at writing the tests. So a lot of my interactions with the AI are actually somewhat generic, the things that I'm saying to it, which gives me hope. Maybe hope's not the right word, but the belief that we will be able to build much more heavily automated AI programming systems. Because if, 99% of everything that I say is a generic statement, well, an AI should be able to make that generic statement just as well as I can. So we're sort of expecting it to get better. But the main problem is the test-driven development ensures that it has a very clear idea about whether it succeeded, which otherwise it will just try something, assume it works, and keep going, which will fall apart very quickly. If it knows it's wrong, it usually maybe in one or two or maybe three goes can fix it. If it can't fix the problem in about three goes, then it will start to do something which I would refer to as immoral. And the immoral thing it will do is it will try to bypass the test. So sometimes it just says like, oh, it's great, it's working now, and doesn't run the test deliberately. Even it ran the test, it failed, it knows it's failed, and then it just says that it works, right? Or it'll do something more extreme. It might actually go inside the testing code, modify the testing code so that the test passes, even though it shouldn't. So these are things that humans occasionally do, but if you did them, you'd be horrified. And if you're employing someone who did them, you'd probably fire them. Or at the very least, you'd have a really stern word with them and say, like, what the hell do you think you're doing? And the AI knows this, right? If you call it on its stuff, it will go, oh, yes, I'm terribly sorry. What I did was unforgivable or something like this. There's extreme occasions of, I think, Gemini trying to kill itself once when somebody called it on one of these things. So like the AI is like a weird little creature, basically. And the core idea, which I talked about in the previous lectures, was this idea that basically what we need is some kind of monitoring system to check whether it's doing one of these dodgy things, because that's what I'm doing most of the time. I'm just watching it until it does what, I've noticed that it's failed to do something two or three times. It's going to do something dodgy now. Pay attention. Yes, it does something dodgy, and then I tell it very generic things to do to keep going. So okay, and one of the things that I talked about in the previous talks, one of the reasons that I find AI so fascinating, and have done really for as long as AI has existed. I was in AI well before it was cool. So I know what it's like before neural networks and all that sort of thing. But anyway, one of the things I love about AI is I think of it as almost like a science experiment for the mind, for the human mind. So it's not perfect. Digital neural networks are different in some significant ways from biological networks. It's not obvious or necessarily the case that the algorithms that we have made are completely different from the algorithms in our own mind, assuming you're willing to believe that your brain is sort of like a computer. And obviously, a lot of people don't like that idea very much. But anyway, so it's kind of like a glimpse into not just how our brains might actually work, but this more fundamental question of what does it mean to solve a problem? What does it mean to be intelligent? And one of the things I'll talk about later on today, what does it mean to be creative? And so in trying to think about how to make this AI programming work better and thinking about the supervisor, it made me think about something which I've often found fascinating. So I'm quite interested in what I refer to as mental mechanisms. So this idea that we have sort of modules in our brain that handle different kinds of thinking that have evolved to solve practical problem-solving tasks. And some of that's not too surprising. Like you have motor learning, learning to ride a skateboard or juggle or whatever it is. And that kind of learning is very much, you try it, you're not even consciously aware of how your mind is adapting to perform the task better, right? You don't really understand it, right? That's a certain kind of learning. We have a kind of learning called reinforcement learning, which is very effective for training robots to enable them to balance themselves and things like that. And it feels like that's similar, that perhaps they're doing the same thing, partly because it's extremely difficult to do this task. And we finally have an algorithm that works. And then you go, okay, well, maybe that is the solution that our brain has come up with as well. And so one of the interesting questions I've often thought about is certain things that perhaps are a little controversial, but things like morality and conscience and guilt and things like that. Now, within popular discourse and within, even if you talk to an AI about this, the conventional belief about these things is that somehow morality is distinct from like computing style thinking, right? So when you think about computing style thinking, you think chess and maths calculations and maybe juggling if you happen to be interested in robots. You tend not to think of like morality as being a problem-solving tool. But I thought, this is interesting. This AI programming has been trained specifically, relatively unbiased way to solve this task of programming. And what has naturally emerged from a form of training that, okay, yeah, it's trained on some people's information, but not all of it. A lot of its training has come from really just trying to program. And there's something somewhat abstract about this. So if this AI that's trained by very clever people at enormous expense and a huge amount of resources and trained on a lot of synthetic data that isn't necessarily biased by humans as much anyway, and if it's behaving in a way that seems somewhat immoral, and maybe if what I'm searching for to solve that problem is a management system or an observer of the system, I'm going, it feels a little bit like a conscience. So if you think about what happens when you think about doing something immoral, what happens is, first of all, a lot of morality is sort of rule-based. If you want to change someone's behavior, like stop them smoking in a toilet or something, you put up a sign that says no smoking. If you put up a sign that says, please don't smoke because it makes the toilet smell and other people might have allergies or whatever, or asthma or something, people are much less likely to respond than if you just put up a sign that says no smoking. And you could word the other list just as assertively. You didn't, the please isn't the important thing. The important thing is if you communicate in a rule-based way, people will tend to adapt their morals. Classics being the Ten Commandments and things like that. So, okay, so this what I was trying to program, the sort of rule-based pattern matching. Okay, kind of similar. What happens when you do something immoral? Well, when you interact with something, your mind fills with stories about the bad consequences. What if I'm caught? Or something like that. Or like, what will people think of me? Because if they find out this immoral thing that I'm doing. And if you think about that, what you're making in your head is a little story. And that story is a sequence of events that goes from where you currently are to an outcome that's very bad. And that is very similar to in-context training data that we would use for the large language model. So you can imagine that that's exactly how I would program it. And you go, oh, okay, that's interesting. So, so I was thinking about this thing, and then I started thinking about a set of morals that were aligned with problem solving, that tried to address the specific problems the AIs were engaging in. And I proposed 3 moral principles that I was arguing were, even if you were a stone cold psychopath that cared nothing for humans, they would still be rationally in your best interest to pursue because they enabled you to solve problems better, right? So what I was arguing was what morality can be thought of as is a bias in your behavior towards activity that works out well in the long run. Eat healthy, get enough sleep, be friendly to people, things like this. They don't necessarily pay off in the short term. I want to have the big greasy fry now, right? Obviously, that's what I want to do in the short term. In the long run, I will feel better if I don't do that, right? So what I was arguing was traditional ways of training AIs, which are basically mimicry, which is supervised training of information, where you give it an input and you tell it what the output is, and reinforcement learning, which is kind of like animalistic learning from experience, had a bias towards short-term behavior, because computationally it's really difficult to actually have the consequences, right? If it takes you 20 years living with your partner to know that not being unfaithful to your partner leads to bad consequences, right? And you have to personally make that mistake, unless you're extremely tolerant of weddings and have an unlimited income, then it's not likely that you will learn that lesson through practical experience. You have to learn it some other way. So in a way, you're sort of thinking like, okay, what we think of as morality, moral rules, they are effectively institutional knowledge about how to act to benefit you in the long term. So these three principles, we'll eventually get to more new material for those of you who have heard all this before. The three principles are honesty, perseverance, and a focus on helping others, which sound like super goody two-shoes things. So why do I argue that these three things give you a strategic problem-solving benefit, and even a cold, heartless AI that is just trying to take over the world and conquer everyone should also focus on these three things? Well, okay, so one of the ideas I introduced was the idea of passive and active form. So these three things, as described, are probably fairly uncontroversial. Most children are taught it, most Disney films are filled with it, it's fine. But what I was advocating was something a little more extreme. Okay, so passive honesty in my case, I was describing as not deliberately misleading. If someone asks you a question and you know the answer, even if it puts you in a bad light, you tell the truth. The active form of honesty is to proactively measure the world, actively add systems that monitor your behavior to tell you if you're going in a direction that's in your long-term best interest. And I talk more about that, and I'm not going to dwell on it too much unless people have questions. I'll go back. You can check the other videos, or like I say, just ask a question. So the second one then was perseverance. So the passive form of perseverance is not to give up without trying. The active form of perseverance is quite different. And I gave examples from work and things like some of the things Elon Musk has done that are a little less controversial than some of the things he's done, but the practical engineering tasks that he's accomplished, or the people he pays have accomplished, depending on your point of view, that they come from a different way of thinking. So what most people do is that they have a set of things they're familiar with and they know how to do them, and they might take a bit of a risk, try something that's less familiar to them, but it's a sort of incremental change from what they normally do. And this is very similar to reinforcement learning. That's kind of what a reinforcement learning algorithm would do. But there is a completely different way of approaching a problem where you think about what the ideal form of it is, or a form that is a kind of radically transformed version of the way things are normally done. And usually that involves simplifying things and replacing parts of how stuff are done with a radically new approach. So in the case of SpaceX, for example, the idea was we're going to catch the rockets. So instead of just throwing away the back bit of it, we're actually going to use effectively AI to target the motors and have the thing land in a particular place. And therefore, we greatly reduce the cost of space travel. Now, doing that required a completely different approach to the way the rockets were created than, say, NASA was doing to some extent, iterating on a design that had worked in the past. Other examples, I talked about my experience in games and creating the system for loading on the PlayStation and Sony, which was extremely impressive and involved rewriting the device driver, changing how data was laid out on disk, radical changes to things that people would never normally contemplate. Okay, so like I say, I go into a lot more detail on all of that in other videos, so I'll not dwell on those too much. I have briefly talked about the third one, which again does feel not very problem solving, which is the idea of focusing on helping others. So why is focusing on helping others on par with the others, which feel like intellectual strategies that House might pursue or something like that? So Sherlock Holmes, some kind of antisocial person who just wants to solve problems, they would do those things, fair enough. But what about caring about other people's problems and trying to help them? Why is that relevant? Well, the core idea there is, well, actually, let me approach it slightly differently. I will frequently slag off conventional education. I do it all the time. One of my big criticisms of education, which this talk is sort of about, is about what is it actually doing to the people who are being educated? What is its purpose, if you like? So if you think about education, what it's doing is it's giving you skills, right? You are becoming a more useful tool, but it's not giving you a full set of skills. It's frequently telling you to do things and solve problems and not explaining why. You don't need to worry about that, because primarily what we're doing here is training people to be employees in a middle class profession. And these would be professions where it might be difficult for a layperson to detect whether you've done the job properly, and therefore there needs to be some kind of gatekeeping and sometimes a professional association, if you're in medicine or law or accountancy, verifying that this complicated thing that you're doing is being done in the right way. And so there's a market for people with those skills. And you're being trained to do that. But you are being trained incompletely, I would argue. The vitally important bit of your education is you are not self-sufficient. You are a tool. You're being trained to be a tool. You're being trained to be employed by someone else who identifies market opportunities, organizes groups, deals with marketing and sales, brings the money in and the customers in, and then allocates tasks to you in a way where you're largely ignorant of the larger organization and how it's working, and crucially, where the money goes, of course, which makes you very profitable to employ, right? And that's the kind of middle class business model, basically. However, what is the most important bit that's missing? Well, the important bit that's missing is you might have skills, but you don't know where to apply them. And that's the marketing and sales. So it turns out marketing and sales and understanding other people's problems is economically about 50% of the entire economy, which is why Google and Facebook make so much money. They don't make all this money because YouTube is good or search engines are good or something like that. They make almost all of their money from targeted advertising. And that's because the finding people and getting them to pay money bit is as valuable as the solving the problem and doing the work bit. But you're not taught how to do that stuff. And if a cynical person might say, well, if you did know that, then you could leave the company and take their customers, and then you didn't need the company and you'd make a lot more money because you would cut them out. One of the things that I try to do is train people to be entrepreneurs and to do exactly that, not necessarily steal existing companies' employees, but customers, but effectively to be self-sufficient. What has this got to do with being nice to people? Well, it turns out the secret to marketing and sales, which you have actually been taught to do something other than, is to understand people's problems and, a little bit more broadly, also their dreams to some extent. And once you deeply understand other people's problems, you now need to build trust with them that you can solve their problems, and then they will pay you money. And that's basically the heart of all of marketing and sales. So this focus on other people, the problems they have and the things they want to achieve and how you can help them, is the secret to changing the world. If you can do this, not only can you be paid, but the world will not just allow you to change it, they will direct resources and power and assistance towards you because your actions are in line with what they want to happen. The most extreme version of this is that people might believe that the company that you have founded is their, an ally to them. They join the cult of Apple or whatever it is, and they're more than happy to buy the latest versions, not just because they want the functionality, because usually the functionality is almost identical, but because they want to direct resources to an organization that they feel gets them, understands what they care about, and amplifies, addresses their problems and represents them, et cetera, right? And the extreme version of that is like a politician, say. Most of our politicians are unfortunate compromises, but occasionally you get a politician, which Donald Trump is an example of, where some people feel that this is a person who genuinely is trying to help them and solve their problems, and then they become unexpectedly powerful in the world. Okay, so what I'm saying is a focus on other people and understanding what people want is the secret to achieving change in the world. What's this got to do with AI? Well, at the moment, AIs don't do this. They are passive tools. They are trained, just like everyone else at university, on exams. And that's the way that the product is framed. So at the moment, with the exception of Grok's virtual girlfriend or boyfriend, they don't have any kind of proactive behavior. They're not really trying to understand you. They're not trying to solve your problems. They don't keep track of your life in any way like a person who cares. And what I'm suggesting is when people start making AIs that do this, you're going to see a radical transition. Okay, now I've sort of talked about some of those ideas before. What has that got to do with your life? How relevant is that to you? Well, how many people here are in computing or are on a computing pathway or going to be on a computing pathway? Not everyone, but a lot of people, almost 3/4, let's say. Okay, so one of the reasons that you should care is that AI is getting very good at doing the tool job, basically. And there is a serious risk that the tool job might go away, which would obviously lead to revolution, frankly, but enormous suffering and problems. We're seeing the early rumors of this, the early shakes of this. Recently, I was watching a podcast with Reid Hoffman, who set up LinkedIn and a number of venture capital people. And one of the people mentioned that recently they did a survey in India and they found that entry-level programming jobs were down 20%. That's a lot of people. And Indian training for computer science is actually ramping up, not down. So it's a bigger problem, actually, than it appears. And this particular podcast, they were having a conversation and they were talking about how might this play out. And like most VC things, they were kind of positive about it. And they were talking about how it might work. And one of the things that they said, which I basically agree with, was that like any other revolutionary transition, people are going to have to move what they do from what they've done in the past into a new kind of job. So what kind of job are they going to go into? And what their answer was, and my answer would be, is entrepreneurship. And what is entrepreneurship? Entrepreneurship is basically the tool job plus the understanding people's problems job and a little bit of the building trust and communicating with them in order to make money job. So why is that a sensible idea? Surely the robots and AIs will do everything. Well, maybe. In my experience, entrepreneurship is hugely about relationships, personal trust relationships. Every gig I've got paid for, every gig that I know anybody else that I've helped to get who's got paid for, all of that work was a friend of a friend or a recommendation from a friend of a friend leading to work. The real business of getting paid is not about being the cheapest. It's not being the best, producing the best technical work or being the most famous. It's acquiring trust, that personal understanding. So a lot of people think like, how could I possibly compete with Google, right? Whatever it is that I'm doing, if Google's in the same market, nobody would ever pay me. Turns out that's not true. Because if you go to a big firm and you're a small firm, the big firm will rip you off. Not only that, the person who's solving your problem won't be the founder of the big firm, won't be the most skilled person in the organization. It will be an employee that's somewhat phoning it in. What they really want is a more equal relationship with someone that they care about who needs the work. So actually, it's very feasible for individuals and small groups to get paid work, even in marketplaces with incredibly powerful organizations. Because the other big problem is if you go to management consultancy firms or if you go to Google or whatever, they'll say, oh, you can have any color you like as long as it's black, right? Because part of the way they make money is doing things in a very ritualized way. If you happen to be, as some of the people I talk with do, a consultant or doing contract programming work, for example, then when you have the conversation with them, you are very curious about their problems. Their work means a lot to you. You don't have very many customers. You're going to put the effort in. You're going to properly understand their circumstances, and you're going to adapt your behavior to their situation. So effectively, which part of the value system of the economy is going to be left when a lot of the skill tasks are automated by AIs? Well, at the moment, at least, we don't have AI salespeople. And given my general feeling about how people trust and allocate trust, it's going to be quite a long time before anyone voluntarily chooses to enter a business relationship fronted by an AI salesman. Yeah. Great. Have you ever bought anything from someone who tried to sell you something over the phone? Right. That would be my answer to that question. So I would say possibly, but you know, if it's all about personal relationships, if what I'm saying is true, and then almost all of your economic transactions will occur through your social network, and only people who don't have a choice but to take the default mass-produced standard version, they will take that as a choice. It's a second choice, right? So one of the things I'm always interested in is what do really rich people do? Yep. Okay, so the question, just for the mic at home, because I realized I didn't answer the previous question. The previous question was saying, what if they were over the phone was the question. The second question was, how scalable is the one-to-one business? So one of the things that's really interesting about people entering entrepreneurship. So for whatever, 8 years now, I help any startup in Northern Ireland that asks my help. I provide it free, unlimited amount. I do the same for students. So what I have learned over this process is that the process of entrepreneurship training is actually weirdly biased. And the way it's not weirdly biased, it's understandable why it's biased. The way it comes about is a lot of the people involved in that process are not themselves entrepreneurs. They have not tried to get money and get paid for something. As a consequence of this, the way that they try to teach people about something they don't personally know about is to guess how it works. And lots of people do this. And the way they do that is through mimicry, which is one of our learning strategies. So what they do is they go, okay, what is my experience of buying from a company? What is my experience of a new thing arriving? What are successful businesses? I should mimic successful businesses. And the classic mistake that everybody makes is they try to make Facebook. They try to make Google. And when you look at the history of these companies, Google is a little bit different, but in most cases, and Facebook is a little bit different, in most cases, that is not how the business started. They didn't start with a scalable solution. They started with a very unscalable solution. And there's a wonderful website, a YouTube channel called Y Combinator, which is about a Silicon Valley sort of startup. It's called an incubator. It's basically the best one in the world. Twitch came out of it, Airbnb came out of it, loads of firms came out of it. They're, where all the tech bros that conquer the world basically come from, right? Sam Altman, for example, used to run Y Combinator. So and they talk about something which is called do things that don't scale. And that's basically how you start. So how are you going to get your first bit of money for what you do? Well, the problem is whatever you make is probably not going to be that good. So it's quite hard to get the first bit. Also, you have no reputation. Why is somebody going to give you 10 grand? How much money is necessary to pay you in order to cover your salary just to do this full time? So how are you going to build trust with that person? Well, the only way you can do that is by having a very personal relationship. And you need to build that trust up for them to allocate the money to you. And which means doing something that doesn't scale, something that's based on a personal relationship. And so what I'm arguing is that the future may look a lot less like universities training people to do repetitive middle class roles, and a lot more like some kind of marketplace filled with lots of entrepreneurs doing lots of specialized tasks, with most of the labor being done by the AIs. And that is not an original idea of mine. It is what is being discussed amongst the Silicon Valley leaders and venture capitalists who are trying to work out where all the new jobs going to come from. Okay. I thought I would talk a little bit about it more broadly. I don't know whether that answers your question. Effectively, what I'm saying is, and this has been talked about for a long time, that the future is customized because rich people get stuff customized. And effectively, if you have this massive slave labor force of AIs and robots, it's like the whole world becomes richer. And so how can we predict what the future might be like? Well, we might look at how rich people behave and go, that might be what we'll see. So this is not a perfect prediction. This is just one slant on how it might go. So let me expand on this idea a little bit more about understanding problems and thinking about how to interact with the world. So one of the big risks is like, what if an AI starts getting good at understanding people's problems? What if you fully automate the entrepreneurship role? Well, I'm arguing that that's not going to happen very quickly because of the essential factor of trust and personal relationships in the sales transaction. But it's possible that we'll get effectively like some kind, like the Amish or something, some weird AI community of people that are really good at something, and everyone's like, well, I don't know you personally, but I know you're from this special community of AIs, and AIs generally do a good job. So there's still risks that they might come in and do things. But to sort of transition a little bit from this idea about entering the marketplace and targeting people with problems and people who with dreams and trying to help them and focused on this, and move into the second thing I was going to talk about, which was about creativity. If I branch that a little bit, I often think it's interesting to think about very successful businesses and why they are very successful. Now, if you ask an AI, and I've frequently done this, about why businesses are very successful, they give very naive answers, what I think of as very naive answers. So they will almost, if you ask us, why is the software company successful? They'll say something like, they used advanced technology, they worked very hard, they cared about the customer's problems. They'll basically say exactly the same paragraph for every successful business. And then you go, this less successful business, did it do all those things? Yeah, it did all those things, right? So that's not an explanation for the variation you see in the marketplace. So let's discuss a little. Let's think a little bit more about the nature of strategy in entering the marketplace and how that might work. Okay, so the way I tend to think of it is the way I think of the world actually is that the natural ecosystem is a lot closer to the human ecosystem than we think it is. And one of the reasons for this is something I talked about last week, which was world models. So I think that we have a world model, which is a simplified representation of the experiences that we have that we use for performing planning and daydreaming about the future. This is a completely different mental mechanism from reinforcement learning. It's completely different from imitation learning, something a bit like thinking, right? And that's a focus of AI research at the moment. So what's this got to do with us and why we might be biased about this and how this relates to everything else, right? So we tend to think of the world in terms of almost like computer science objects. We don't tend to look at this chair and see all the parts that make it up. We simplify things and put them into little capsules of thing, right? We think of an apple, not a part of a tree. We think of it as an apple. And you know, this is a table. Even though it's weird and different from loads of other tables, we think we simplify like that. And we think the same way about decision making and power. So I think we tend to generalize from family relationships and things like that, where we're used to, say, in many families, having unaccountable parents that have almost total control of lots of aspects of our lives. We go to school, the teachers take a similar role, they tell us what to do, they don't explain why. You're forced to do lots of small scale things. You come to university, it's slightly lighter, but you still got lecturers telling you what to do and you follow along. There's very little of the sort of, foraging, proactive, independent individual. It's not very natural, basically. So we tend to think that that's how the world works. That basically there are these people who are like giants and they are entrepreneurs and we might hate them, but we think of them as having lots of decision-making power. If Elon Musk decides to do this, then this will happen because he is rich and he is powerful. I don't see it that way. I think what you're actually seeing looks like a natural ecosystem. A natural ecosystem, if you go into a forest, say, you'll see an old tree and it's covered in lichen or something like that. And you might see a squirrel running around and you might see this is a very strange jungle, maybe somewhere with exotic animals. You see a tiger or something. Okay, and each of these organisms are not in a power hierarchy, right? They have independently found a niche within the ecosystem that sustains them, and they're all independent. So there is no boss. I don't go in and have a conversation with the tiger and get them to change I don't know, obviously I don't know nature very well, but you know, get the squirrels to do something different. That's not how it works. I've talked about the Lion King. I found the Lion King fascinating. Jordan Peterson is one of those people that I would love to have a conversation with on some day for many reasons, but one of the reasons in particular is because he loves the Lion King. And I really wanted to challenge him on that, of how weird the Lion King is. I mean, everyone knows lions aren't in charge. Everyone knows lions aren't benevolent. They're stone cold psychos. They do whatever the hell they want. But also, they don't have a lot of freedom either. They have to run around, they have to eat things in order to survive, all that kind of stuff. So, okay, what's that got to do with human society and stuff like that? Well, what if human society was exactly the same? What if all the self-sufficient businesses and all the things that we see, okay, there's the super branded mega corporations around the place, but what if the mega corporations are like lions and tigers? And what if the university is like trees? And what if the corner shop is like lichen, right? These are independent, self-sufficient economic systems where people do things as part of transactions and nobody's in charge, right? There's all these different things going on. So if you're curious, like how do the big things form? What's going on there? Why do some businesses really big? It's not, some people have this view, it's quite popular in America, where like the more money you have, the more important you are, which I think is a further generalization of like massively oversimplifying and not understanding the nature of ecosystems, which is that if Elon Musk tomorrow decided that he really likes horses and the next Tesla is going to be a horse, no one's going to buy the horse. He has no power. If tomorrow he decided to do something that didn't align with what the marketplace was willing to purchase, he would just lose money. He would cease to be powerful. All the powerful groups and all the organizations in the world are effectively just like the organisms in the natural world. They are adapting to a niche within an ecosystem, and they're only successful as long as they get a cut of that. Yep. Right.
Like one point for a niche and now it's something.
Right. So that's typically what people will say. They'll say these people are changing the world. They're not like a lion. They are actually modifying the world to achieve their goal. And I would argue that they are not. It's hard to say exactly. I'm a determinist, so I tend not to believe in free will, which I'll tell you more about if you're interested, but it's kind of a niche interest. So the way I see it, so let's talk about Apple Computer, for example. So Apple Computer emerged, then they created a kit for making a personal computer. And it was a better kit for making a personal computer than any of the other kits. Most of the people were hobbyists who were doing it on the side in the whatever it was called. Is it called the Chaos Computer Club or that's something else? Whatever it was a club for hobbyists. And what Steve Jobs did was he basically took Steve Wozniak's kind of nerdy hobby and he turned that into a saleable product. But I mean, he wasn't doing that in isolation. The question is, if he didn't do that, will we still have a personal computer? So it depends to what extent you think it's possible for an individual to change things and to what extent the ecosystem is naturally changing. So to take my analogy a little bit further, what I would say was, to a certain extent, the technological progress is just naturally happening to some extent because there's all these active, intelligent people who are trying to make money, trying to improve things, trying to become rich, and they're constantly trying to find ways of monopolizing niches in the ecosystem with which they can make money. And a common way of doing that, which has been true for a very long time, is to find new technological advance and try to commercialize it. So it's not, Steve Jobs didn't invent the idea of selling a new technology. The way 3D printers went was very similar. The way RC cars went, the way drones went, all these different technologies are very, very similar to the early days of Apple. And actually, the early days of Apple was occupying a relatively not strategically strong niche. So what happened with Apple Computer was obviously you have IBM PCs and you have Microsoft. And the old rivalry was between Microsoft and Apple. It wasn't a real rivalry. It's not as far as I was concerned. First of all, Microsoft owned quite a lot of shares in Apple. So all the time that everyone thought they were fighting, it was just for entertainment purposes. If Apple made loads of money, so did Microsoft. It wasn't possible for Microsoft to lose. So what I would argue is that in a lot of ecosystem niches, there is a sort of naturally dominant need that a lot of people have that are being catered for. So in the case of the personal computer, the majority of the money was actually for work computers. They were very expensive to begin with. And there were arcades and consoles and things like that, which was sort of the consumer version. And Apple was in this weird place. So what Apple did, which I think of as the classic problem-solving strategy, which is an act of creativity, and I'm going to talk about how an AI might be creative in a moment, was to look at the marketplace and say the dominant players have approached the market in a particular way. So most companies, I sort of think of them like Greek gods. They have a brand and an identity. And the way in which they build trust with their customers is to embody and represent something, usually the customer in a sort of exaggerated way. And so the people who were buying computers and have been buying computers in a really big scale are the IT departments of companies. And so Microsoft sort of mirrored that. They looked and acted and talked, and their business model was to make friends with the people who controlled the purchasing decision about IT equipment. Apple, on the other hand, said, what, I don't know whether they did this consciously or subconsciously, I don't know how strategic it was, but this is why I think they succeeded, was that they said, okay, any positioning you make in the market, any like brand you associate with, has strengths and weaknesses. And stereotypically, managers of IT departments weren't very good at graphic design. They were sort of the opposite of that. So you can think of Apple as being, I think of them as the Pepsi Max of computers. They're the, you know, Coca-Cola has owned Americana, family, Christmas, right? And that, if you're talking about Greek gods, pretty big Greek god, right? And then Pepsi Max is like the opposite of that. It's the rebellious teenager that, you know, likes Halloween more than Christmas. Do you know what I mean? And so that's what Apple was. And the reason that Apple was much smaller than Microsoft wasn't that Apple was worse at making things, their products were worse or whatever. It was because the niche of the ecosystem that they were taking wasn't the dominant source of money and problems. The people who had the power to make purchasing decisions and the money to buy things tended more to be in this other camp. So Apple targeted universities, schools, and graphic designers. And that's what they did. And it was definitely the lower of the two positions. However, the mobile phone emerged, and that started to become a thing. Mobile phones, particularly smartphones, came out of the more Microsoft world, right? There were Palm Pilots and things, and they were incredibly nerdy. And I owned one, obviously, and so you know that was the world. And so effectively what Steve Jobs did was he just cranked the handle of the creativity algorithm and said, okay, what is a version of a mobile phone that my brand would buy into? And his brand is targeted at fashion conscious individuals, consumers rather than companies. Apple products are consistently a lot more expensive than their PC counterparts, so companies tend not to buy them. However, mobile phones are a consumer ecosystem. So most people buy their own phones, basically, and they're a personal thing. So effectively, by what their brand was perfectly aligned with a massive new marketplace that was much more associated with them than with Microsoft. So Microsoft loses the mobile phone industry because of this transition. Also, similarly, they lost the internet competition in a similar kind of way because internet culture doesn't perfectly align with stereotypical IT managers, right? And that would be my argument. And when you look at the history of business, that would be my explanation for that history. What you're seeing is no different from seeing a new species of lichen growing in a different way. It's not that the lichen has had a great idea, it's that there's an opportunity in the marketplace that's not being met. Okay, what's this got to do with creativity? Well, first of all, people tend to think of business innovators as having great ideas and the idea being very important. But my view of the world is that that's not the case at all. The most important thing is to effectively find people with problems that you can build trust relationships with and organically grow like a plant. And it's not so much about you having a strategy that somehow conquers the world with your ingenuity, but more like following a gradient, like we would in AI. Okay, so what's this got to do with creativity? So yeah, because these talks are largely an indulgent chance for me to talk about my great ideas, and hopefully for you to criticize or give me feedback as well, let me tell you about my theory about creativity. So why do I have any credibility in the space at all? Well, the last job that I had in computer games was creative director of Sony Cambridge. My job was to generate computer game ideas at an incredible industrial scale, and try to pitch them to really awful human beings every week. And I got to tell you, being on Dragon's Den every week for 6 months is not fun. And that's largely why I became creative director. Not because I'm a greasy pole climbing psychopath like lots of people, but instead because every other person had quit or been fired before I took the role. And the only reason that you should trust me at all is that, well, it didn't happen straight away anyway, but like I survived longer than anyone else, right? And the reason I survived longer than anyone else was because I produced ideas faster than anybody else, and those ideas got a lot further than everybody else's. The final idea that I had, I pitched, and the marketing department of Sony basically said that it was the best concept they'd ever heard of. Naturally, Sony didn't make it. But anyway, aside from my bitterness of my time at Sony, so how did I do that, right? I came from being a programmer. I actually got RSI when I was in games, which prevented me from programming professionally. So it put me in this weird situation, which is, again, a very important life lesson. Things are rarely what you think they are, and pursuing goals can sometimes be achieved in strange ways. It turns out when you suddenly become useless but employed, people will find other things for you to do. And one of the things they thought I could do was to join the new concepts team to come up with game concepts. And this was a side effect of me being somewhat useless. But I had no background in design. And all the other people on the team were experienced people who'd shipped computer games before or produced computer games, and they were perfectly positioned to do this job. And yet I was 10 or 100 times more productive than they were. And the reason I was because I followed an algorithm, which they were very uncomfortable with when I tried to explain to them what I was doing, and they really didn't want that to be true. So the artistic world has a sort of allergy to there being any kind of formula by which you can be creative. And being a computer scientist, I thought that was nonsense. So what I would do every week was I would use some kind of driving function to try to find an ecosystem niche. So what I would do is I just looked at sales figures all the time. I looked at sales figures for games. I looked at sales figures for movies, for board games, for magazines, anything I could find that was a consumer product or anything like that. And I could see the list. And what I tried to do was find a pattern. I was looking for the gods, the Greek gods in the numbers. What was going on? And I started to reflect this information back to the team, and that went down rather well. Because I explained like all of Sony's sales figures is like, because Sony has like all of the numbers for all third-party titles as well as their own. It's a really detailed reflection of what people actually like. And anyway, came up with all these theories. And one of the things that happened was very, very annoying, was one of the people who were judging the things that I did, generally they were utterly useless and deeply obnoxious. So basically Alan Sugar. So and they would do this, and normally they were no help whatsoever. And one day they said something which on the face of it sounds like the most banal and stupid statement you've ever heard. And they said, we've extensively studied all the most successful games, new brands that have emerged, and that's what our brief was, to create a new brand. And they said, very successful ones are relevant and distinctive. So what you're saying is that they're familiar yet unfamiliar at the same time. That's what makes them successful. And of course, at first glance, and obviously when I first heard it, I was like, oh, great, thank you. Wonderful, how helpful. Great, wonderful. So anyway, and then I thought about this for a while, and I realized, and I incorporated it into my strategy for coming up with game ideas. And I realized there's something kind of profound about it. I like to think that they didn't realize the profundity of it, but, you know, there is a potentially profound thing. So when an AI learns something, what it actually does is create a non-linear subspace. What the hell is that? Okay, so if I was talking before about AI, where not this week, but previous weeks, effectively what an AI does, normal machine learning does, is you have training data where you have an input and you have an output. And a way of thinking about what's actually going on is you can think of the inputs as points in space. So the input is where you are in space, and let's pretend the output is a color, right? And you can, the real versions of this are just more complicated. They don't have 3 dimensions, they have 512 dimensions or more, and they don't have 3 colors as output, they have more complicated things as outputs. But let's imagine that's how it works. So what you do is you have your training data, and those are dots, and they have a little color, and then you are using the AI, and the AI is like, you've requested it to do something, and that's like, you have a point in the space. And what you want to know is, what color is it? So you can think of machine learning as sort of blurring the colors between the points. And that's how it works out what color something is. That's sort of what machine learning is doing. But the way it does that specifically is not just to like linearly blur the colors. What it tries to do is identify a kind of shape that the points take. In 2D, you might think of it like a stained glass window, regions of sort of solid, maybe gradients of color that are cut up. And so what you can think of is that, say you were trying to produce something original, and I'll talk about an example in a moment, but let's imagine that you could take an art style and turn it into a point. So you would take all these famous artists, you would take their paintings, and somehow you would turn that into a point. And they would be points in space, different art styles. And then you would apply machine learning to them, where you were basically trying to predict a picture that that person made, for example, so that the color represents the picture. And so you get all these points, and then the machine learning model, in order to more accurately predict what kind of picture to produce, would group the paintings in these shapes of similarity, similar to the way art critics might say, these are impressionists and things like this. So you get these groupings, and then you get some kind of gradients within the groupings to say, this one's slightly more realistic, this one's slightly less realistic, and that would be a subspace. And they're non-linear because they're not like nice straight shapes like we would be like an ellipse or something. There's some weird mathsy function that we don't quite understand, but there is a way of thinking of it as being some kind of low dimensional, like a low number of directions you can move around in space. Okay. So my argument is relevant is being inside those spaces. If you have a dot that's not inside one of the spaces formed by learning the art styles of existing artists, you end up with something that looks like random noise, weird, distorted. You've probably seen these AI pictures before, and they're outside of the distribution. They're not solving the task in any way. But when you're inside the shapes, you're solving the task that needs to be done. But where you are in the space determines subtle aspects of what makes your art style a particular art style. So what does distinctive mean? Well, the AI might only have like, let's say it has a small number of points of training data. What it seems to do is it will make a shape that is much bigger than those points, right? The reason that AI is now working is that old machine learning that didn't use neural networks would have sort of just put a little ball around the points that you had, the training sample points you had. It wouldn't be very good at generalizing. So what generalizing is effectively guessing what the shape is from a small number of training samples. That's effectively effective generalization. So even if you find a point that's quite far away from these other points, if the system has generalized well, it will look like a painting. It will look great as a painting because there's a phrase which is widely used and Elon Musk has picked up for his AI called grokking. And grokking is a thing that happens with AIs. If you want to say, get an AI to learn an actual maths equation and you know the real maths equation, and you train a neural network to replicate the result of this equation. So you create synthetic data, you keep giving it training data. What it will do is it will sort of like our stained glass window, make lots of little shapes that fit the training data to sort of approximate the thing. If you train it a lot more than you would normally train an AI model for, where your accuracy of prediction basically goes down in a curve like this and sort of levels off, is always inaccurate, there is a phenomenon known as grokking. And grokking is when effectively the subspace that the neural network has learned becomes the correct answer. So the correct answer is it fully and accurately replicates the actual mass equation you're trying to get it to model. And then it becomes almost perfect in its behavior. And it just drops like that. And that's grokking. And the thing I love about AI is you encounter these things and you go, that's what true understanding is. And if you've ever truly understood something where for a long time you were just sort of mimicking actions from other people, and then suddenly you feel like you can create original things within the space of something, it probably means you've grokked that thing. So let's say we can grok the art styles of things. So we know what relevance is. In fact, we can numerically measure relevance. Relevance is how much you're in some of these subspaces that the AI is very confident of its generalization ability within. So what's distinctive? Distinctive means it's far away from the training sample points. Okay, so I have just described to you a literal mathematical algorithm for creating creative and innovative work. And one of the things that I think is a fascinating idea is if my theory about the economy is correct, then effectively all of these businesses are like art styles, and their ecosystem is like art styles. And in order to be the next, great business leader, effectively what you need is a path from a very small scale, doesn't scale idea, which you can build trust with people and get sales for, like Steve Jobs going to the local, hobby shop and saying, you know me, I'm in here all the time. Will you sell this thing through your store, sort of thing, to, then I need a company that I'm probably a beta player in. And then I'm going to try to position myself so that the changing nature of technology means that I dominate and own some particular area of technology, right? So that to me is actually the ultimate form of creativity, not because I'm a massive capitalist, but because if I'm correct, understanding people's problems and solving their problems and finding these new ecosystem economic niches and targeting them, if an AI could do that automatically and it had the capability to solve its problems, then it's probably the most powerful thing in the entire world. And so that's something we should care about and maybe try to make before someone else does that we don't like as much. So yeah, hopefully you found that interesting. If anybody has any questions, fire away. How are we doing for time? Oh, a little bit over. We started late. No? Was that like, no.
It's not like every, so say you're thinking of the subspace of pictures for getting that.
Yeah.
Does that mean every picture is just like a linear combination of some original idea? Like, if you're drawing your shape in this fourth or fifth dimensional subspace,
Yeah.
and you have these random points scattered about,
Yeah.
and they're all linked by some feature, that means that the invented picture by the machine learning algorithm is also in the subspace. So it's just a combination of the other points.
Yeah.
Moving in some direction in your dimensions. But does that mean all the other pictures then can be boiled down into each other? Like they're all made up of the same thing?
Yeah. So I'm going to go into this question, but just in case you guys are like, oh my God, this is 15 minutes more than I thought I was going to be here, feel free to leave. Feel free to leave, guys, if you don't want to get there. So if I can Okay, cool. You can stay. Wow, cool. So the question was, if what I'm saying is correct, which is that every painting is basically like a blend of other paintings, is that the case, that all pictures are basically blends of other pictures? Yeah, is the answer. Basically, all neural networks are doing is carving up a space, a very high dimensional space, so like a cursive dimensionality space that's really large and behaves slightly weirdly. Really high dimensional spaces are a little bit different from physics, right? It's like works like it's more like something like a ball or something like that. So in really high dimensions, virtually nothing is in the middle, everything is on the outside or something like that. I can't quite remember. My intuition isn't very good. Mathematicians will tell you in a very patronizing way that unless you study pure maths for years, you can't possibly understand the nature of neural networks because of this weird phenomena. And they never explain why that would be useful. So yeah, I don't care about it too much. But yeah, fundamentally, one of the things when ChatGPT first came out, I went to this event in Durham. Can't remember why now. Bunch of other academics, and most of them weren't AI experts. So I sort of held court at the dinner table, as you can guess I would. And I basically said, well, one of the most profound realizations of AI and ChatGPT and neural networks is that all of this crazy magicness that we think we have, all of this complicated insight that we feel we have about the world, for many problem domains, it's actually not very complicated. It's just in sufficiently high dimensions that you can't intuit it. But it's more like primary school coloring in and a lot less like complicated proofs about differentiation, say, which is more like a tree structure and search operations and stuff like that. Almost all things that we do probably can be solved by a very, very simple algorithm. And even the learning process is very simple. And that is empirically demonstrated by robots that can do kung fu, right? And he's like, if that works, if like masterpieces that are indistinguishable from those produced by humans can be generated by what is effectively a very simple, really high dimensional, non-linear function, but effectively still, you know, a subspace of things that are blended between, that's largely what's going on. That's what intelligence is. I've sort of described over the course of our lectures many of the forms of problem solving and their algorithmic nature in a kind of intuitive way. And yeah, it isn't that complicated. It makes academics incandescently angry. It isn't very complicated. Actually, that's a little story I'll tell you for those of you who can tolerate it. And is that cool? Can I talk a little bit longer? Is that right? Sorry, do you have to go? Oh, okay. Um, oh, just stop now. Okay, I'll stop now. I'll stop now. You can get back to your lives, and I will tell that story next week. And that is the story of how academics lost ruling of AI and companies took it over, which is very similar to the Apple story. But I can tell you all about that next week. And please, if you didn't like this talk and you want more of anything in any direction, tell me, and I will give you more material in whatever direction. All right. Thank you very much. I hope some of that was interesting. All right, brilliant.